Now we're going to talk about our long-term, our non-current assets, right? And again, there's a particular systematic order that we have to process this information for our financial reporting. And so I'm going to share it with you in that particular order. And basically, you should just understand the rules and regulations about where to properly classify it and how to categorize it, right? And so now we're going into our current assets, and we know by definition those are everything except that the non-currents, right? So these are the ones that we're going to convert into cash longer than a year or operating cycle, okay? Your first particular long-term asset account is called investments, long-term investments. So that's the name of the category. Long-term investments is a category that consists of several accounts. So that would be the title of the section of the accounts in this particular order, right? So we have long-term investments, and those are all investments, period, that convert into cash longer than a year operating cycle. And we mentioned some of them where they will go, right? We say any receivable that extends beyond a year is considered a long-term investment. Any note receivable, if it's otherwise specified, if the note is not less than a year or operating cycle, it automatically becomes an investment. So when you see no receivable, automatically place it as an investment unless it matures less than a year. We also have certain cash restrictions. Now let me step aside and explain to you what cash restrictions are. Cash restrictions is when you have cash restricted or set aside for a long-term future purchase. Well, it doesn't have to necessarily be a long-term future purchase, but for a future purchase or future use. Okay? And so we may restrict cash for various sorts of things, to pay off stuff or to purchase something. All right? Now, a cash restriction is dictated based on how long you holding or restricting the cash. Okay? So, obviously, if you holding cash aside for 2 months, then that'll be a cash equivalent. If you're holding cash aside for longer than 2 months but less than a year, that would be considered a short-term investment, cash restriction, right? Now, sometimes when we borrow money, when we issue bonds, we're borrowing money to raise capital. And sometimes we borrow millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so for us to properly be able to have enough cash set aside so that we can pay off our creditors, we set cash restrictions. And one of the cash restrictions is mostly frequently known as bond sinking funds. So anytime you see the word bond sinking fund, think of it as a long-term cash restriction that's there to pay off bonds years later down the line. Most of the time, bond sinking funds will fall in this category, long-term investments. Now, sometimes companies purchase land and they use it for operational purposes. Well, most of the time, that's what companies do. They buy land, they put buildings on it, and it helps them operate their business. It's operational assets. But sometimes people buy land, companies buy land for speculation purposes, right? Kind of like house flippers or whatever the stuff on HGTV. They'll buy the land and speculate that it's going to appreciate in value, and so they'll use that as a particular instrument of an investment, right, to get a gain. Any land held for speculation, that's a key word, held for speculation, must always be considered a long-term investment. So you got a bunch of stuff that can fall in a long-term investment. Bond sinking funds, long-term cash restrictions, any long-term investments, right? Any long-term bonds that we buy, that we lend to a company, right? That we purchase, will go here, okay? Those long-term account receivables and the note receivables. All that will fall in as an investment, okay? The next one we're going to talk about are our PP&E accounts. PP&E, property, plant, and equipment. So those are those operational assets that I spoke of earlier, right? These are the ones that help us operate our business. We hold them for a very long time because that's how we successfully engage in business, whatever we're trying to do to generate our revenues, right? And so those property and plant and equipment pieces, those long-term assets, for the most part, they all depreciate. So all of our PP&E accounts, we depreciate, right? Furniture, equipment, buildings, all of that good stuff, right? So all of that will go here. And we know when we report for depreciation on a balance sheet, we always list the assets at their book value. So you must list the asset, and directly under it, you must subtract accumulated depreciation so that it can be reported correctly. Okay. What else do I want to mention about the property, plant, equipment? Okay. Some companies consider land to be a PP&E account. Some don't. All right. And so it's really no right or wrong way. But what I would encourage you guys to do is just go ahead and put it in there with them. Okay. So in your property, plant, and PP&E category, list land first, and then list all your other accounts, and make sure to report them at their book value, subtracting the accumulated depreciation. Okay. Your next asset is going to be called intangible assets. Intangible assets are those long-term assets, right, that we don't see, right? You can't see. So that would be your copyrights, your patents, your franchise, license agreements, trademarks, all of that good stuff. Goodwill is actually an intangible we'll talk about later in the semester. But those are your intangibles, and they fall right after your PP&E accounts. We're still on long-term assets. Now, intangibles lose value in terms of financial reporting as well, just like depreciation, but we don't call it that. We call it amortization. But for right now, let's just understand that we're going to report our intangibles right here. Last but not least, guys, the very last asset, the very last long-term asset is going to be those other asset accounts. Those other asset accounts. And for right now, with the purpose of this particular course, there are several things that could be considered other assets. But I just want you guys to understand the one that I mentioned earlier. Okay, you could have deferred revenues and all that other stuff in here, but we're not going to go that sophisticated with that. So just understand that that portion of your prepaid that I spoke of in the previous lecture, that portion of your prepaid that extends beyond the operating cycle must be reported as an other asset, and this is where it would actually go in the category. That pretty much summarizes our long-term asset categories that follows on the balance sheet. So make sure you understand them, make sure you know the rules of thumb, and make sure you are able to successfully create that.